Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, bot builders, depending on what time it is for you in the world where you are. I hope you're all having a lovely morning, afternoon, evening, depending on the magic of time zones. My name is Robert. Welcome to the Botpress Basics office hours. If you're new here, welcome. I'm so glad to have you. We host these once a week, every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. They're for our new to Botpress or low-code enthusiasts. If you're a developer, you're more than welcome here. And we've got office hours for developers hosted on Thursdays by my colleague Patrick, which you might also find instructive. Let me run you through how I typically hold these streams and what it is that we do here. Based on the questions that I get on the Discord server over the last couple of days, over the last week, I usually come prepared with a lesson or something to show all of you. But of course, I encourage you to ask your questions. The whole point of this is to build together. So if you've got questions, do not be shy to ask them. Don't be shy to derail me, and then we will build bots together. So that's typically how I host these. If you're watching the recording of this on YouTube, come join our server sometime. Come chat with us live. There's nothing I enjoy more than talking to other bot builders, so we'd love to have you. Great hair, Robert. Thank you. I will assume that you meant this honestly, and I will also say that for the last year and a half, I have been cutting my hair myself, which is a bananas thing to do. But if you got short, relatively simple hair, I'd highly recommend it. It's a fun time. Before I dive into today's stream, we have a question from Navita. They ask, can I make the chat a personal one? If the user inputs their information, can I have the bot respond by saying things like, hi, Cindy, or bye, Cindy? Yeah, A's giving you a great answer there. Just save those values as a variable, and then you can reference them throughout the conversation. So Navita, there's videos on our YouTube channel about saving things in a variable, referencing them later on. And then you might also find, I'll be doing a lot of that in today's stream as well, so you may find that useful. Speaking of today's stream, let's dive into the studio for today. I've got a nice little thing planned for us. The idea here is I get a lot of questions that the response to which is you can make an API call for that, and I think that's a satisfying answer if you're a beginner developer, let's say. But if you're brand new or you use low code tools, making API calls can be a bit frightening, I'll say. I'm going to run us through some best practices, particularly if you're a no code developer or a no code enthusiast, ways to kind of get around that or to upskill yourself, specifically in the context of Botpress, because unlocking the ability to make simple API calls also unlocks the ability to make your bot 100 times more flexible or lots of different use cases. So that's what we'll be doing today. If you're worried about making API calls, I would say stay tuned to the stream. Don't worry about it. We'll get through this together. And I'll run us through a simple use case that I think actually is pretty neat. I think it's a pretty cool one to kind of personalize your bot's conversations a bit more. Can I ask questions about Botpress v12? We've got a dedicated channel on the server for v12. I'm going to say that all of the kind of live streams and things that we do are focused on Botpress Cloud, since they're things we can build on together. But we do have a channel on our server for v12, so you might find other v12 builders there. For those of you who don't know, the v12 Botpress v12 is our legacy offering that is completely open source. You can find it on the GitHub repo Botpress. Can we make the bot full screen? Yeah, Carolyn's got you there with a great link to our docs. Speedier than I am. Cow licks all over the place. All right, let us begin building for today, and I will run us through what I'd like us to do. On last week's stream, what I did was I came to class. I keep wanting to say come to class. I used to be a teacher, a lecturer, so I keep saying things like this. You'll have to forgive me. But I came to last week's stream with a bot already built, and what I did was I ran through it, and then we kind of rebuilt it from the ground up. And I think that was pretty helpful. So to give you a sense of what it does, I will start by typing here in the emulator. I'll say hi, and nothing happens because this isn't connected. I'll say hi again. And we see that my bot is saying afternoon. Now I wonder why my bot is saying afternoon. Let's find out together. So we'll see here I've just got three simple nodes set up. One that does some crunching, and one that spits out afternoon, and one that spits out morning. I'm not following my bot building guidelines. I do like to keep my nodes named so I know what's going on. I'll call this one crunching. And I'll run all of you through what each of these nodes do from start to finish. So in theory, what happens here is that this is an execute code card. If you're unfamiliar, the execute code card just takes some code that you write or copy and paste in from ChatGPT, or use the Botpress AI to let it generate for you. You don't even have to leave the studio. You can pop this over here. It'll execute some custom code, do a task, and then maybe give you some information that you will manipulate later on, which is what we're doing here. So let's click into our code. Let's see what's going on. So if you're not a coder, don't worry. I think we can parse together what's happening here. We see we're making an API call. And again, I'll run us through all of these things, but we're making an API call. We're saving some of the time. We're saving some of that information to a variable, and we're saving those informations to variables we can use later on in our flow. So essentially, we're just getting the time in Paris, and we're saving some of that information for later. So we're telling our bot, go find out what time it is right now in Paris, and then we'll do something with that later on. So that's what the execute code card is doing. And then I've set up two transitions here. I've set up if the value of the variable Paris time num, which is just a name that I gave it, is between noon and midnight. And then here, if it's between midnight and noon, send afternoon or morning, depending on what the value is. Now, a little bit of behind the scenes scoop here. What I've done is I've saved the value of the variable Paris time num equal to just the hour. So if it's, you see here in the example that I ran earlier, it was 20. And that means that it's 8 p.m. in Paris, so we're sending the afternoon message. Of course, we can get a bit more granular with this. So we could send good night or you're up at the crack of dawn. But for the purpose of this example, I kept it relatively simple. So what we've done is we've taken the time, we've extracted the hour, and we're sending a greeting to the user based on the hour that the bot knows what time it is in Paris. So let's take a step back for a sec. I think part of the reason you would want to do this is you're telling your bot, go find out what time it is in a city and greet the user accordingly. I'll talk maybe more at the end of the stream about different ways that you could personalize this or make this simpler, but the kind of high level or abstract goal that we want to achieve is you've taken your bot and you've made it more personal. So instead of saying hello, you're able to give it a certain time in a certain city and say, this is the greeting that you should give based on that time. All right. I see questions about making the full screen bot responsive. Do we need to add media queries? I would say, yeah, there's Carolyn's got you with CSS there. So take a look there. And otherwise, continue, let us know what you try over on the help channel if you run into more difficulties with that. Can't Be Spell asks about listening intent cards. I don't have information that I can share on that. We live on the feature requests channel, so it is something that we're aware of. The information I can share is we're looking at the best way to implement this in a way that makes sense on Botpress. So I can't say soon, not soon. I have no timelines for you, but we see you, we hear you, we know. We hang out on that channel as well. All right, let us continue. So I think now that we've kind of run through what the kind of workflow here is, let's start, but let's rebuild this. And then we can talk about this kind of level up or super scale feature later. So we'll do a couple of things first. I'll start by showing you maybe how I would begin approaching the execute code card to make an API request. Now, here's let's talk about APIs for a sec. Let's take a step back. API is, the technical term is application programming interface. The best way I've ever heard it described to me is when you're at a restaurant and you order food from a waiter, the waiter functions as the API between you and the kitchen. So the idea here is how do you take the thing that you want to be done? So when you order food in a restaurant, you want something to happen in the kitchen, but you're not going to go to the kitchen yourself and tell the chef what to cook. So there's got to be a middle layer between those two services. So between you saying, I want this to happen, and the kitchen starting to work on it and then bringing you the food, something's got to happen in the middle there, and that's the waiter. Back to the world of software, the API is the waiter. So in other words, the API is the middle layer between you and some kind of service you're trying to access. In this case, in the example that we have in front of us today, the API that we're accessing is the world time API. This is an open one that you don't need a key to access, which means that it's free. I won't deal with keys now. We'll talk about them later. But the idea here is the world time API is a service out there that will spit out when you ask it to the time for a certain city. Okay, so we know that, we've done that. Here we are, great. Now, how do we actually do that? There are a couple of different ways. You could hard code it, like you could write the code yourself, but I don't know how to do that. I'm not a developer, that's not my thing. And I like to do things fast anyways. So there are two ways. One, you could hop over to ChatGPT and ask it to do it for you and it could come out great. Or you could just do it directly within Botpress and see how that goes. Botpress also uses the OpenAI API to generate this code, so in theory it should be similar. But let's take a gander. Let's try and do this together. We can see here that the label that Botpress has given my previous code here is retrieve and store the current time in Paris. I'll use that as my prompt to generate some code here, and we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to go ahead and generate some code. I'll hit enter, and we see that here. Now, because this is using the OpenAI API, we're likely to run into some issues. So instead, the issue here is that we're not calling the world time API. So I'm going to add it. I'm going to say using the world time API. And we see, I don't think we need any of this. And we accept the changes. And there we go. There's probably a couple of different things that we need to change here, but this is how we would begin doing this. All right, are we allowed to take voice inputs in the bot and how? Currently, we don't support the ability, or we don't natively support the ability to input files from your users. So things like voice files, images, etc. So there are like user tutorials on the Discord server about using a third-party service, but like natively in Botpress, you can't currently do that today. All right, let's compare this with the code that we already have that we know works, and let's see if there's any similarities or differences, etc. So I'm gonna maybe just copy paste this down here and then bring it into the code here. We could have just copy pasted the code that we know works in the beginning, but the reason I'm doing this is because part of the whole process here is to learn something, new. So the idea is, if you're at this stream, chances are you are like a low-code enthusiast. And one of the things that we want to do is be able to upskill ourselves. So let's take a gander here. We see that a couple of things are missing, particularly the hour. So the whole function of this feature is that we find out what the current hour is in Paris, and we give a greeting based on that hour. So we need to add that in. So let's go ahead and do that. We need to define hour as equal to Paris hour, of course. And we'll set these as well. All right, let's continue looking. And maybe we'll just replace this code here with this as well, because there are a couple of different irregularities. And we're done. Okay, so here we have the code in front of us, and let's just verify that this works in the way that we expect. So I'll just call this gets Paris time. Excellent. And we see that executes without an error, and I'm wondering, did it fire? So let's check our event debugger. Let's check the logs. We see it's green, so it worked, and that works nicely. To verify that this is working, I'm going to send some text cards, as always. So let's go ahead and just pop two, because I've got two variables here. We want, of course, the time in Paris, which we're saving to workflow.paristime. If you're wondering what all these other variables are, they're a secret tool that will help us later, because I'm going to make this task a little harder for us, and we'll make our bot maybe a bit more powerful. Maybe it can do a couple more cool things. So we try that again, and we see what's going on here. So let's zoom right in. We've got two variables here. One is going to be the Luxon format of the current time in Paris. This is like a standardized ISO format for date time. So you can see here, this is 2024, February 27th at 8:17 p.m. And then what we've done is we've extracted just this. So for the purposes of this bot, all that we want to know is what hour it is. Is it around 8 o'clock? Is it around 8 a.m.? Is it 9 a.m.? Based on that information, we'll send a greeting like good morning or good afternoon. So we've extracted the hour, we've saved that to the variable Paris time num, and now all we need to do is just send a simple greeting based on that value. So we know this works, I'll go ahead and show you how I set up those transition cards. If you're wondering what a transition card is, these expression cards over here in the card tray, they're under the category flow logic. They're called this because they allow you to define the conditions for a transition. In other words, they're a simple if-then statement that allows you to say, if this goes over here, if the value of this is this, then maybe go this way. And if the value is this is something else, then maybe go this way. In other words, you might say something like, if the ball is red, go down this path. And if the ball is green, go down this path. And that tells your bot that you can do this. Of course, Botpress is always designed with non-developers in mind, so you can define the conditions for those transitions up here. In other words, like you would prompt ChatGPT, you can just prompt your bot to define the conditions for you. So let's do this together. I'll say that if the value of the variable Paris time num is between 0 and 12, and I'll do the same thing, but for 12 and 24. Why did I select these numbers? 24 hours in a day. So in other words, you could absolutely define maybe like if you want to put 4 here, if you want to do 0 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 18, and 18 to 24, you could do that as well. I like to keep things simple, so I'll just do before noon and afternoon. But that's the logic of what's going on here. And we'll go ahead here. This one I believe is our morning one. And this one will be our afternoon one. So now we've got a bot that will find the time in Paris and that will send a message based on that time. And of course, you can customize the city based on either the prompt that you give the Botpress AI to generate that code for you, or by popping into the code and editing it yourself. I'll show you that in a sec. I'll say good morning, and here I'll say a good afternoon. And then of course, let's say I wanted to pick a different city. I would just pop over to the request here, Europe. Maybe I could put Berlin, maybe I could put London, etc. Depending on, what's relevant for me in the project I'm working on. Robert handles code too well for a non-coder. Oopsie. I'm definitely not a coder, but like, given the work that I do, it's kind of like a, nature of the business. But I always try to speak to the people that are also, from a non-coding background. I definitely didn't study computer science in college. Can we tell the translator agent to skip translating the URLs? You can disable the translator agent on specific nodes, which you might find useful. Uznik, there's, yeah, exactly. Carolyn's got you there. So you can't tell it to ignore URLs as a whole because URLs are just strings. So it has no way of differentiating. But what you can do is maybe isolate your URLs in a specific node and then just turn it off on that node. That's what I would do. So if you're sending a URL, just be sure to put that in its own node. Let's make sure that this bot that we built together works. So I'll say hi, we get the time in Paris, and of course the time in Paris is 8:21, so we send good afternoon. Okay, now this is cool, this is interesting, this is like a nice kind of dip your toe in the water in the world of making API calls. And the purpose of this is to illustrate to you, if you're ever on the Discord server, and a answer to questions I give often is, if the service you're trying to integrate with or work with exposes an API, which most services do, many services do, then you can absolutely make requests to that API using Botpress. The thing is, not everybody knows what that means, and it's not the most intuitive answer. It's the right answer, but sometimes you're like, okay, but how do I actually do that? So the idea behind me showing you this is how you would make an API call. Depending on how you would write the code for your specific API and based on the service you're using, they're all going to spit out different information. Remember our analogy from earlier, not all restaurants will make the same food or work the same way, but they're all, the idea of, you interfacing with the kitchen is similar across the board. So the idea here is I've shown you how to make an API call, how to take the information that you want, design your bot around it, and then use that information later on in your flow. But let's see if we could take this one step further. This was kind of a challenge I gave to myself this morning, was like, all right, but what if I don't want to do the transition based on the Paris time zone? What if I want to do it based on something that the user provides, like a user provided city? It's a bit more complicated, so buckle up. We're going to do this together. But that's what we'll be doing today, is we'll be taking the API skill that we just developed, this kind of execute code, make an API call, and then put it into the context of a bot that you would actually like put on a website or something. So for example, you don't want to greet a user in Tokyo based on a time zone in Paris. It doesn't really make any sense. So you'd want to be able to customize it based on what the user is providing you with. So that's what we'll do now. We'll take that API skill, we'll level up again, as we always do here, and we will use this. Do you mind showing how to do the transition between the timeout flow and the main one? There is no transition between the timeout flow and the main one. It will only transition or trigger on timeout, as the name suggests. So if we pop over into our bot settings here and we see inactivity timeout, the only way the timeout workflow will trigger is after 30 minutes or 29 minutes or 28 minutes or 27 minutes, depending on what you select as your value there. All right, let's test this out. Let's see that this works. Now, because of the way that the world time API works, we need two values. We need the user city and the continent. We can't just give it a city because it's going to be like, I don't know what to do with that. So there are some limitations here, and we can get creative about the ways that we work around them. But I just want to show you, this is how I would do this. So maybe I'll collect the user continent first. I'll say, hi. My continent is America. Oh, I got to change the text on these capture cards from my testing earlier. You're seeing the nitty gritty behind the scenes, how the sausage is made at Botpress. I'll say Montreal. You get the time. And of course, it is 3:25 in Montreal, which is 15. And that's what we want. Okay, great. Now, let's see how we actually did that. And we can recreate it. You can go back to main from the timeout. So here, I guess I can show you. When you end here, you've got two options. This ends the conversation. So like if the user just completely times out, this will just end the conversation by default. Or you can go back to the main workflow by doing how do you do that? I'm expecting to execute a workflow, but that doesn't seem to be, hang on. I'm losing my marbles. All right, Itai, yeah, I see where you're getting stuck. Give me a moment because I'm expecting the main workflow to come back and execute. Give me a sec. There might be like a bug on our end, or maybe just a visual thing or something that I'm not understanding correctly. So let me follow up with you after the stream. I'll shoot you a message, or I'll ping you on the general channel. If anyone else is curious, I'll be hanging out there as well. Okay. So let's try setting this up together. Now, let's return back to our world time API request that we created earlier. I will use this as kind of a jumping off point for the work we're about to do later. So here I see that we need two pieces of information. One is the continent, Europe, and one is the city, Paris. Now I can get both of these pieces of information from my user pretty confidently. So let's try that out here. User continent, I'll say this is the one I have to collect, and then user city, same thing. So we've collected Europe and Paris, but now what do we do with them? So now my bot, in other words, when I say that I've collected them, my bot knows that my user is in Europe and in Paris, but how do I actually tell the bot, okay, now that you know what the user city is, go find it in the world time API. Go ask the world time API to spit out the time for Europe, Paris. Here's how. So we'll pop back into the code, and there are a couple of things that we're going to do here. The first thing I want you to pay attention to is the API call. This is the request that we're already familiar with. It's the exact same one we're using in that other card, but with two key differences. The first is that Europe has been replaced by this value, continent, and Paris has been replaced by this value, city. There are a couple of different like formatting notation things to note here. By putting the $sign and the curly braces here, curly brackets, what we've done is we've denoted that this is a variable. So in other words, this is like a placeholder text to be filled when we know the value of continent. Same thing for city. So the idea here is we've told our bot, hey, I don't know the continent and the city yet, but once I do, you can go ahead and replace these with the information I've collected from my user. So in other words, we've told our bot, you will know the information in a bit, but you don't know it now. And when you do, you can behave flexibly based on that information. So now the bot asks us, okay, but how am I going to know what the city and the continent are? Well, that's great. That's easy. What we've done is when we've asked the user for the continent and the city, we store those results in two variables, one called user city, one called user continent. These are workflow variables in Botpress. We pop back into our code editor and we see that we're defining the value of city as workflow.userCity. In other words, that time that we just collected, that city that we just collected, and we're defining continent as workflow.userContinent. In other words, what we just collected from our user. So we're telling our bot, in other words, imagine this conversation you're having with your bot, you're saying to it, okay, I'm going to collect these two pieces of information, user city and user continent, and you use them for the information continent and city. Easy peasy. So now that's what's happening here. We're saying we're collecting those pieces of information. Based on that information, collect the time from the World Time API, or the kitchen in our analogy, and then we'll isolate the city and then spit that information back out. Let's verify that this is working before we make this like a little more advanced. So we'll say, hi, continent Europe, and then city Berlin. It should be nighttime in Berlin, which it is. And there we go. And so now what we've done is we've taken the skill that we developed previously, just get the time in Paris, and we now have a piece of information. It's 9 p.m. in Berlin, and so we're able to maybe do the exact same thing that we did previously with those expression cards. So we can take that expression, pop it here, and if the value of the variable user city hour is between 0 and 12, and we'll do the same thing below. All right. And so this is a great way of like, often on the Botpress server, what I see is people will ask like, how do I take the user city and then like send an appropriate greeting? So I think this was specifically a question that was asked on our server. And I thought that's a really great way to demonstrate how I would go about developing this skill. So I think the first way that you would want to do this is like the kind of knee-jerk response that most bot builders have is to just go whole hog and say, okay, this is what I want to do. But if you're not familiar with making API calls, if you're not familiar with how things like the World Time API work, and you're new to all of this, and you're also new to Botpress, you're compounding a lot of different skills that maybe you haven't developed yet. So instead, we start with the simplest version of the task, which is what we did over here, just getting the time in a defined city, and then we make it more complicated for ourselves over here. I'll just finish up this transition. The value of the variable user city hour is between 12 and 24. All right, and we'll just send that to two different things. So for example, as I was working on this earlier this morning, this code kind of just was messing me up, and it was giving me a hard time, and it wasn't working. And the reason was it was telling me that it was like 10 p.m. in Halifax, which it absolutely was not, and that it was 5 hours later. And the solution for that was I needed to essentially tell the bot that it already had the time zone. Now, I wouldn't have known to do this if I didn't A, ask my colleague Patrick, and then B, check the ISO, the Luxon date time, this part, the documentation for this. But I didn't have to do this over there when I was checking the time zone in Paris. So this is what I mean by starting with the simplest version of the task you're trying to accomplish, and then upskilling yourself from there. So that's what I would recommend, is to always be like, okay, I have this complicated thing that I want my bot to do. Find the time in any city in the world, and then greet the user accordingly. But like, is there a simpler way that I can find this out at the beginning, and then go from there? That's what I would recommend to all of you. Can we add any of our custom button in the bot, like near the send button? Yeah, as Carolyn says, you would want to deploy. So we do support the ability to just deploy a custom UI. But as Carolyn says, like, that's definitely a step beyond styling. Styling is changing elements that we give you the ability to change, and developing custom UIs, like building the entire front end of your bot from scratch, which I wouldn't recommend to most people. So PU, I hope that I don't know if that's a satisfying answer to your question, but that is certainly, Carolyn is giving you the right of it there. If you are like a developer and you're familiar with building a custom UI, it shouldn't be the hardest thing in the world for you to do. But we do find that most people using Botpress just deploy the default web chat with styling options enabled, of which adding a custom button for send is not possible. Although, what do you mean by before send button? Do you mean like replacing the send button with an image of your choice? I'd be curious to know what you mean by that. So this is making API calls. This is the, if you've been building bots and you're like, okay, a lot of the bots that I build are pretty similar, or I'm looking for ways to kind of upskill the bots that I build or put on my website or my clients' websites, the idea here is making API calls is going to be the thing that takes your bots to the next level. Now, there are a couple of different ways around this. I would say that realistically, there is currently no reliable way to automate all of this process, but you can automate away a lot of the chunks that are like tedious or difficult. So in other words, when I started this project, I had no idea what the world time API was or how it worked. So I asked both Botpress and the ChatGPT code generator to generate some code that would make this API call for me in JavaScript. Once that was finished, I had a much better starting point to kind of be able to fine tune what I wanted to do after that. We often, I am a fan of no-code tools, but we refer to Botpress as low-code for this reason. So in other words, a bot is just code that executes programmatically in a linear way that you define using these fun little cards and nodes and whatnot. But the idea here is everything that you're doing is just translated into code. You just have a visual interface for it in front of you. But of course, in order to do things that are maybe like a little more customized or a little more beyond the scope of what Botpress supports natively, it is, I'm not going to say necessary, but learning this will allow you to stand out both like amongst other bot builders and then also from like other bots that you've built in the past. So if you really want to wow people, I would say that taking a couple of hours to upskill yourself here is great. Decay says that it's easy to do if you know some React. I'm going to say that I don't know if anything is easy, but I think Decay would probably know more than me in this case. Yeah. So that's kind of like the soapbox speech that I have for making API calls. I bring this up because it's a response that I give very often on the server, is when people will say like, hey, here's this third-party tool I'm using. Does Botpress integrate with it? Sure. Maybe yes, maybe no. For instance, let's talk a bit about integrations. The web chat, for example, functions as an integration. When you enable things like the Notion integration and whatnot, you'll see cards that show up here. But all those cards are individual snippets of code that we've abstracted or hidden the code away from you and put in a little picture here, just to make it easier for you to build bots. In other words, what that means is you can just use any integration that exists out there, any third-party service that exposes their API, you could just write the code yourself instead of having to wait for us to build these little cards for you. In other words, there are like a million services out there, and we can't integrate all of them because that takes time and effort, and we're like, we've got finite resources over here. But it's entirely possible for you to do if that's something that interests you as well, and if the third-party service you're looking to integrate with exposes their API. Dum dum dum. So that's what I would recommend as like a good starting point for making these kinds of, things that your bot can do that will allow you to stand out among the crowd. I think there are a lot of bot builders out there today, and of course we're all looking for ways to kind of upskill ourselves, and this is one that I would recommend. There's a lot of conversation about like, is coding dead? Is programming dead? I don't think so. I mean, I don't know that I'm like necessarily qualified to comment on this, but I think if there are things that your bot can do that someone else's can't, then of course coding isn't dead. You're going to need a bigger boat. Ain't that the truth? All right. I am going to ask if there are any questions that any of you have that I haven't yet covered. Speak now or forever hold your bot building piece, because we're just running up to the end of today's stream. I hope that you found it useful. If you're watching the video of this on YouTube later on, I hope that you also found this useful. If you're not on the Discord server yet and you're watching the recording of this on YouTube, come join us sometime. We have a great time. The chat is lively. The server is very lively. If there's things you want to know about Botpress, or if you want to just talk to us, the Botpress team, you want to make a feature request, or you want to help debug yourself, the Discord server is a great place to do that. Otherwise, thank you all for joining me today. I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of the week. I'll potentially see some of you at Patrick's stream on Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, and I will see you later. Bye, everyone, and happy bot building.